talks with international writers, and we also host master classes and creative writing workshops online and offline. And today's workshop, I just want to say, is going to be recorded. We will send you a link to the recording after the workshop, so you'll have 2 weeks to watch it and rewatch it at your convenience. As I mentioned before, there's going to be a short break in between. It's 2 hours, so we understand that we'll need to recharge our batteries in between. And we'll ask also that you mute yourself during the workshop, except when there's a discussion time. If you have a question or if you have a comment, you can use the chat to ask. Or on the left-hand side, you can see there is a sort of something called Q, where you can virtually raise your hand and ask a question. So that will just alert Andrew to the fact that you'd like to make a comment or ask a question. And I'll say a few words about our workshop master today, Andrew Kauffmann. Andrew is a coach, writer, and a teacher of creative writing. He's trained in the use of expressive and therapeutic writing, and he uses stories, metaphor, and narrative tools to help his coaching clients cope with life transitions. And he is currently the writer in residence at the UK Centre for Mental Health. He has led memoir and queer storytelling courses and workshops at London Lit Lab and Out on the Page, among others. And in 2021, he won the Spread the Word and Scribe UK competition for his nonfiction work. So Andrew, I hand over to you for a fruitful workshop.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay, just to check? Got nodding heads and thumbs up, so that's good. Great to be here, and a huge thanks to the Right Salon for helping to organise today. I'm also really grateful to all of you on a Saturday for joining. We've got a reasonably packed agenda, but at the same time, I think we've got plenty of time to really have some interactive exercises, some time for self-reflection, and also some time for writing today. And ultimately, that's where we want to get to by the end of today's workshop, for you to be, at least in principle, committed to something new, whatever that might be. It doesn't matter whether you're a poet, a memoirist, a journalist, a writer of flash fiction, you're in the right place. Before we do begin, I know some of you have said a little bit on chat where you're from. I would just like to maybe in the chat function, you're more than welcome to unmute yourself, but it might be quicker in the chat function, just to now say a few words around one question that I think is pertinent for today. We're now writing on what's tough. And my question that I'd be keen to get your take on is, what makes any day, any typical day for you, less tough? Just as a way of, again, introducing ourselves, getting a bit of a sense of who's in the room today and warming ourselves up. So you can find the chat function on that left-hand bar. Just keen to find out from you, in a few words or a sentence in the chat function, what could be anything at all, what makes any day for you a little bit less tough? Love to hear your reflections, your experiences. We've got some typing going on. Journaling and meditation, absolutely. Joe, time in the garden. Certainly time for reading or writing. Mandy, authentic, real emphasis on this word, authentic, connecting with self, having that real time, that real space to be able to do that, and others. Yeah. Time in nature and hearing some music which brings back some pleasant memories from the past. By all means, keep them coming. Nature, writing, reading, and playing music. Some similar anchors that we turn to keep us connected to ourselves. For me, to role model, I'd like to share, it's actually similar to one of your answers, which is that I really need the time to take a walk and not to think about anything too intellectual, not to be in my head at least once a day. I like to be fully embodied and to be in nature or walking and just be experiencing any given day something that doesn't allow me just to be cognitive, but to be really embodied. And that can be in nature or to be walking around a city centre. And Marta, connecting with people, good music, good food, great. Okay, so all of you, welcome. We're really pleased to have you here. One of the key things that I want to get across today is this is a safe space. There's going to be an opportunity for you to do a little bit of self-reflection on your own writing, what you perhaps are more often than not reflecting on in your writing, themes, ideas, stories, but also things that perhaps we're avoiding, things that perhaps we'd rather not really write about because perhaps they're uncomfortable. What I want to emphasize right at the outset is there's no compulsion, there's no expectation for any of you to have to share anything. We'd love you to if you want to, and there is the facility for you to unmute yourself and to ask questions throughout. Please do feel that you can do that. We want this to be interactive. But at the same time, because of the sensitive nature of this topic, writing challenging and personal material, I really want to be clear that one of our norms, if you like, for today's session is that we're not going to be putting anybody on the spot. We're not going to be saying, can you read out what's tough for you? Or can you read out what you've written down on your own notepad? So I hope that's clear. And in that spirit, anything that we do hear from others today is, of course, confidential. I hope that's all okay for everyone, just in terms of how we're going to run the session and the format. So if you have a notepad, this is actually going to be super handy because we're actually going to get straight into an immediate exercise and I'm going to guide you through it. So do make that available to you, or if you've got your personal device, your laptop, you can write away on that too. What are we talking about today? We're talking about the many, many moments where there are either memories or life events or experiences which we ourselves or others who are important to us have gone through. They may have, over time, really caused us to think very deeply, and yet somehow we've struggled to put them into words. Somehow we've felt, okay, that's not a story that we can tell in any form, poetry or fiction or non-fiction. And what we're looking at is why. Why do we avoid those topics? What is it about those things that are difficult to write about? Not just in terms of technique and craft, but in terms of the emotional terrain, psychologically what's difficult. And crucially, by the end of today, we're going to have a look at techniques, tactics, strategies. What can we do to make ourselves feel safer? What are our options? How might we write the tough stuff while still maintaining our emotional well-being and risking, yes, some moments where we're stretching ourselves, but not risking anything too much in terms of our emotional well-being. So my first question to all of you, and it comes from a writer I hugely admire. It's not my question, it's hers. Her name is Saidiya Hartman, and she's written, among other texts, Lose Your Mother and an essay, Venus in Two Acts. Saidiya Hartman has posed the question, how does one write impossible stories? Seemingly impossible stories. I want to simplify her question even further. A question I want to ask you right at the outset, our first exercise for some self-reflection for you, a few minutes, will be, what do you believe are your impossible stories? In other words, what are the topics or themes, events maybe, that have occurred in your life or others' lives that feel too difficult to write about for whatever reason? I'd like you to jot that down, have a think. What are your impossible stories? What's seemingly impossible to write about? And if you do have a chance, write a few words also examining why, or at least interrogating why they might seem impossible to you. I'm just going to give you a few minutes to do that right at the outset. Okay, thank you. I recognize that first exercise may itself be quite triggering in some ways, and allow yourself to acknowledge anything that may have arisen for you there that's difficult, and to know that it's not at all abnormal to feel, oh gosh, I really don't want to think about that anymore now. I wish to put that to one side. That's quite okay. And in fact, if it's so uncomfortable what you've thought about there, then indeed as we're going to explain in the workshop, it might be actually quite right that you put that to one side, for the moment at least. We'll return to why. Let me role model by explaining a little bit about my own journey, why this topic is even of interest to me as a writer. I'm also a coach, and I'm a very strong believer in one of the big sentiments that is featured in Audre Lorde's work, as well as many other writers' work, but in the cancer journals, where Audre Lorde is talking about her experience of living with cancer as a long-term illness. She's reflecting on her own life and her own experience of what she has gone through with her illness. And she says, "My silence did not protect me, and your silence would not protect you." And effectively, the key message, and this is echoed in so many other writers' work, is that we can, as writers, find that we're circling, that we write many things, but there are things that perhaps we find over time that we're not expanding on, or that we're not explicitly reflecting or exposing in our work. And there might be good reasons for that. There might be reasons why we're not opting in our writing to talk about certain things, but they might show up inadvertently or rather indirectly in our work. And I think the question that Audre Lorde was posing, and which I like to pose at least to myself in terms of my own writing, which is, am I ever self-censoring? What are my own inhibitions when it comes to my own writing? And are those things that I feel genuinely need to work as barriers to stop me publishing? Or are those just things that I've added as constraints? Are they avoidable and unnecessary obstacles to writing? And so one additional thing I've had to think about very carefully in my own story is that I was a kidney donor for my father a few years ago. He experienced end-stage renal disease, so kidney failure, effectively. And I was finding in my writing that whatever else I wrote about, whether it was short stories or any other fiction, I kept on thinking I can't avoid this biggest of subjects, which is affecting me, which is what are my own obligations to my father, if any? What are any child's obligations to their aging parent, if any? And for a while, I thought, I can't write about this, at least not ethically, because it would upset my father. And that sat very heavily on me. But in the end, I thought, well, isn't there going to be something fairly therapeutic or at least cathartic in trying to at least determine what is going on in this whole experience for me of determining whether I wish to be my father's kidney donor or not? And in the end, I did write extensively about the subject, and I've had to navigate that terrain. What is acceptable to me to write about? What is acceptable for me to share with others? What feels too exposing? And I have experienced huge personal benefit, not just in terms of my own writing career, but in terms of psychologically, what I feel I've been able to process, derive meaning from, and being able to write so personally, writing the tough stuff. And I'm a strong advocate of the work that James Pennebaker, a social scientist, has done. I don't know if any of you have heard of James Pennebaker, but essentially he's looked at what are the well-being benefits, indeed, what are the psychological benefits to mental health, where people write about very difficult things that have happened in their lives. Not necessarily trauma, but things that are very difficult indeed. And he has looked at how there are benefits, not just in terms of mood, but actually to physical health over the long term. He did studies on this, academic studies, where people who had experienced, for example, long-term conditions like arthritis and so on, were asked to write for 4 consecutive days, 15 minutes at a time, so they weren't at risk of overwhelming themselves, but 4 days in a row, they were asked to write about something very emotional to them, whatever it was. They didn't have to share it. The point was, they were then tracked. And in this study, it was determined that actually over time, they had fewer health visits to their physicians and their doctors, and they continued the routine, they continued the habit. So there's a question for all of us, which is going to follow on from the first exercise, which I'm keen again for you to engage in your notepads or on your device, which is, do you ever self-censor? I'm going to write these questions in the chat box so you have them available to you there. What are your inhibitions about writing the tough stuff? What do you perceive the barriers to be? So we're going to have 3 or 4 minutes just on that additional self-reflective exercise. Do you ever self-censor in your writing? And added to that, what do you perceive your barriers to be in not writing about certain topics or themes or events? And then we'll come together and have a bit of a chat. Here we go. Okay. So I want to invite any of you who feel comfortable not to necessarily go on camera, although you're welcome to if you wish to, but just to put in the chat box, not the content, not your responses to those questions, because that could be very personal indeed. But what was that experience even like for you to even engage with these questions? Have you engaged with these types of questions before, reflecting on where you venture most with your writing? What are your expectations of your writing? Do you have any? Is it overt and clear to you before you set out writing what you're writing for or for whom? And as a corollary to all of that, do you have clear expectations about what you will not write about? What's too tough? Any reflections at all in the chat box, or put your hand up in the queue? We want to hear from you.
Can you hear me?
Gabriel, I don't know if you were about to come on camera there, or
Yeah, I was. One second. Just
you're very welcome to if you would like to share.
Bluetooth disconnected. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. No, I just wanted to say, I don't know if anyone else has this, but don't self-censor, but I really fear not telling the truth. So I think your memory is a certain texture, right? And it has, and I wrote it here. I just fear not telling the whole truth, of hurting people needlessly for the sake of telling a dynamic story. And sometimes I don't think I'm honest in my own memory. And I went as far as to say, like, I think as a storyteller, this just came out, we want a rapt audience. And sometimes I feel I embellish memory with a dramatic flair that forgets good intentions, and it turns the well-intentioned into the maligned, bystanders into instigators. And I'm always wondering, am I telling the truth? And I'm wondering if it's difficult because there's so many times no one to corroborate my version of events. And then at the same time, I feel that writing is fair game. It's a dialogue with the past. And I think that there is no such thing as truth. There's only perception. I I don't know if that's muddled, but sometimes I feel like I'm betraying the past or events as they happened or people.
Thank you. Thanks, Gabriel, for being so frank there and open and sharing. Any reactions from anybody else in terms of what you've heard from Gabriel? Does that echo? Does that resonate for you? Do you have questions around what it involves to write the truth? What does that even look like for you? Is memory quite a difficult thing to engage with in our writing? What's shown up for others of you here today? What do you find yourself avoiding? What's seemingly impossible? Again, we're not looking for the content, but what has this brought up for you in terms of your reflections, the process? Olivia, yeah.
Hi.
Hi, Olivia.
Yeah, you can hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Similarly to Gabriel, one thing that has come up for me is I really don't want to make my friends and family and loved ones look bad. Even though, I mean, it's not that anyone's done anything really bad, but they might have said a comment here or said something there that contributes to the overall story. But I kind of want to protect them. I don't want to have that confrontation with them of like, yeah, you remember that small comment that you said, something like that.
Very well said, very common concern. And indeed, something can burn inside us as writers for a long, long time, prodding and provoking us, making us feel that we could or should write something down. But in the end, in the final instance, there's a very well sort of understood and justifiable reason why we might not, which is fear of upsetting others. How might others react, particularly close loved ones? Before I move on, any sort of final reflections around this question? What are your impossible stories? What can't you imagine ever writing, and why? Do you self-censor? And what do you perceive the barriers to be? Tony, here we go. Tony, you have a comment? Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was muted. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
This might be a little off the topic, but it seemed to me that I just write as a hobby, but I've always been interested in fiction, and the best fiction that I've always read seems to deal with Joyce, Hemingway, and others. It always seems like the best fiction I've read is basically a kind of semi-autobiographical. And so this self-censorship really, rather than be self-censorship, just becomes fiction. I mean, just as a more comfortable way of expressing yourself, expressing your life thoughts or your experiences, and it becomes entertainment, basically. So I don't know. I find it hard to draw the line between self-censorship and fiction.
And indeed, people do find a middle way sometimes through autofiction, and this is a term that's becoming more and more widespread and popular now. Annie Ernaux, the Nobel Prize laureate winner a couple of years ago, talks, or it's talked about her writing that she writes autofiction. And so there's this question around, okay, well, what is indeed fictional about the piece that one's writing? But at least through finding character and finding other names for those characters, at least one can write with the pretense that actually everything is a fiction in the world that they're presenting, and that this isn't strictly autobiographical. And people need those necessary fictions. We saw that in the quote from the handout that was circulated in advance from poet Andrew Macmillan. He said that he was astonished sometimes that people read too closely for his comfort into what his poems, because he felt that they were all necessary fictions, was his quote. And actually by his third collection, he was starting to really come to terms with the idea that everybody was reading real detail into everything that he's writing as if it was a reflection on him and his life and his partner. Great, thank you, Tony. Okay, by all means, keep the reflections coming in the chat box. I'm going to turn this on its head now. I'm going to actually ask you in our final exercise just of this section to think conversely about what you do with your writing. Where do you venture most? What do you find your habits are? Who is your, if there is indeed, intended audience? So let me just put them in the chat box in a moment, but I'm just going to kind of ask these questions from a different perspective. Where do you venture most with your writing? That's the first one. So what I mean by that is, what do you find yourself returning to, either in terms of topics or characters or themes, things you wish to say with your writing? I'll put these in the chat box, but number one, where do you venture most with your writing? Number two, what's at stake when you write? In fact, being even more existential about it, why do you write? To explore or say what? And third question, do you have an imagined reader or an ideal reader of your work? So those are three questions I'd like you to have 3 or 4 minutes on now. I'll put them in the chat box, and here we go. I love the little, I don't know if you will hear it. I hear it. I hear a little ring every time our time is up, which is making me feel like we're in an actual sort of writing workshops, which we are. So that's great. Thank you. Thanks again for these moments where we're having to be very self-reflective, and that doesn't always come easily, or even naturally sometimes. Sometimes we don't have to overthink our writing. Free writing, flow writing, however you might refer to it, journaling, one of you referenced earlier, allows us to write without being too conscious of what we're writing at all. What this exercise is doing is getting us just to reflect a little bit on where we go to. What are our writing habits? And again, viewing it through that lens, what are we not choosing to write about? And is that because we're clear and we're quite definitive in choosing not to write about certain topics? Or is there something that we're beginning to mull over? Are we beginning to think through, okay, we could take more risks, more calculated risks with our writing? So some thoughts from any of you on anything that we've discussed there. Where do you venture most with your writing? What is at stake when you write? Have you even thought about your writing in these terms? Are you indeed looking to say something, explore something through your writing? And do you have an imagined or an ideal reader? Some of you are typing. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the chat box, or indeed, as ever, for you to put your hand up in the queue. No, I think Joe was starting to type. Marta, yes, great to hear from you. Are you okay to speak, Marta?
I didn't mean to put my hand up this time. It was for earlier.
Apologies.
Earlier question. Yeah. No, this is something that is very
please
important.
do feel free if there was something that we missed earlier from the conversation. There's no sort of sequence to this that means that you can't share what you wanted to share earlier. We'd love to hear from you.
Oh, earlier it was only about how I think it's my own pride that sometimes makes me self-censor myself when I write, because there's a certain light that I don't want people to see me in, for example. So I was thinking along those lines, that it's, you know, not wanting people to see me in a certain way that stops me from writing stuff, maybe.
And only if it feels comfortable. If not, let me just pose the question and it can sort of float in the air rhetorically. Is there, how can I frame this? Is there sometimes a constraint because we're thinking of people that we know well that are likely to read our writing?
Yeah, probably. Yeah, it's probably the most, the ones we love most, or the people that we maybe admire. Yeah, or maybe just strangers as well. Just, you know, there's certain things where you think, oh, I'm not sure that I want people to see me. Yeah, in a moment, particularly when we're talking about things that are difficult, that we've been through, that are difficult. And so you think, I don't want people to see me this low, if you see what I mean. So that you want to portray yourself in a better light.
Totally hear that. This week, in fact, I've recently had my first essay as writer in residence for the UK Centre for Mental Health published. And it's obviously reached some people who know me very well, who maybe knew I had experienced mental health problems in my past, weren't aware that I was still experiencing them, and they're getting in touch and they're saying, oh my goodness, you know, are you okay? And I have an invitation from them to have a conversation about what I've written about. And it's interesting because some have then said, why have you written this? Interesting that people pose this question, you know, almost sort of, it's like they're interrogating, you know, what's going on for you psychologically that you feel that you wanted to not just write this, but to share it.
Interesting.
Annie, we have...
Hello.
Yeah, hi, Annie.
Hi. Yeah, in relation to what Marta just said, and also your previous question about self-censorship, and in connection with this question, I also tend to censor myself in terms of the thoughts. I'm drawn to writing about where the turmoil is and where the raw emotions are, but I don't like to write pure raw thoughts. Also for fear of expressing unpopular thoughts or just being seen as a horrible person, right? So what I tend to do, or where I venture, is to digest it a little bit, digest and process, so that I come out the other side. So I'm not writing completely raw, but using maybe tools of psychology or philosophy to present myself as a more behaved version of what I'm feeling. So it's a little bit more processed, and the lesson that I like to add, like the lesson that I've learned from the horrible thoughts that come out. And I guess who I have in mind when I write is people who are going through the same thing, that if this is helping me, then maybe it'll help you.
Yeah. I love a phrase that Lily Dunn, a mentor of mine who's published the book Sins of My Father about her difficult childhood. I love a phrase of hers that touches on what you've just shared, Annie, which is, how can your writing be a gift, not just to yourself, but to others who may be going through something similar? How can it be framed as such, written so it's not re-traumatizing? Because actually we may write with such visceral, intense passion about the very thing that was tough, that actually we have not necessarily processed that event, that life experience. And Dr. Tracy Macmillan Cotton, in the handout that I circulated, said that she really notices the difference between pieces of writing where you feel someone's wounds have scabbed over. And the point there being, how can one create enough psychological distance, or distance at least in terms of time, between something that created some real intense emotions and then the ability to write about it with a sense of not being indifferent or dispassionate in any way about those events, but how can you write about it in a way that seeks to determine for yourself, if not for the reader, what it is that the lesson might be from what you're sharing here? Does that resonate at all?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I don't want to take up too much time, but just on that, I feel like if I'm always writing about the lesson that I've learned from whatever raw emotion I go through, I might be presenting myself as someone who has learned the wisdom, when many times I just don't feel wise, you know. So, you know, as you said, like friends reach out, like, why do you write about that? That really helped me. You're so wise. But it's because I grabbed things from my shelf to help me through it. But a week ago, I was not like this. You know, I was breaking down.
Yeah. Thank you, Annie, for sharing and sharing, I'm sure, a sentiment and an experience a number of us do reflect on. We're going to break in about 5 or so minutes, but what I'm going to introduce before the break is our first exercise to actually write, not to do self-reflection, but to get writing. And then I'm going to have a little exercise for you in the break if you have a chance to ponder. So there's 2 things coming up which are going to be interactive. I just wanted to respond to the comment that you made though, Annie, which is, I see now a tendency more and more for writers to engage in what they talk about as anti-memoir. Jen Ashworth, who's written about her experience of long-term illness, said that she rejected the idea that she needed to reach for any easy morals to her story. Easy moral being, oh, you know, love hurts. We all self-repair in the end. She said that actually she rejected that framework, that model, which she would even subscribe to the idea that it's part of sort of capitalist thinking, perhaps, which is, you know, that everything has to have some neat conclusion. And she actually said, no, there is wretchedness sometimes, or at least there's incomprehension and ambiguity, confusion and doubt in what I'm going through. And so I don't need to draw neat, superficial, incorrect conclusions where there are not conclusions to draw. In my experience, I am still experiencing long-term illness, and sometimes I'm feeling better and sometimes I'm feeling worse, but I don't need, for myself or for the reader, to try and create a superficial conclusion that isn't an authentic conclusion. And I think that's just worth reflecting on. How do we avoid going for the easy moral if one doesn't exist in writing what's tough? Gabriel, yeah, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I know you want to keep moving. I was reading Margaret Atwood's like on writing, and maybe this will help you, Annie, too. She says one of the motivations of a writer is also revenge. And that really, she said, writers write for one of three reasons. And it really resonated with me too, that you are allowed as a writer, that's the freedom of it, to write about revenge. And I always think of this quote is, beware of the boy cast out of the village, he'll return to set it on fire just to feel its warmth. And I love that concept too, that, you know, you can give yourself the space to be diabolical. And I think that that's where I like to come from, is that I can be as bad as I want in my writing, the things I can't do in maybe my real life, you know, even in memoir more.
Oh, totally. Mary Carr, who's written a lot of books on the craft of memoir, said at a conference a year or two back when someone posed this question, you know, how can you expose so much of what's gone on in terms of what other people have done? You know, why not just concentrate on your story? She said, hang on, you know, well, first of all, if they didn't behave so badly in the first place, maybe they'd think about that and they wouldn't have ended up in my story. I'm not forming a judgment on that, but that was what was said. And second, they can write their own good damn story. You know, everyone's got a book in them. So she was quite sort of strident in saying, you know, sorry, I don't have to avoid going to certain places for fear that it might offend people. Now, that's someone who's very experienced in writing and maybe got a very particular tone and approach. It's not going to work for us all, but there is indeed that sentiment that says, look, you know, I don't have to hold myself back just because other people want me to. Okay, I'm going to introduce two things now, and then we'll go into the break as we head to the hour. First thing, metaphor, the power of metaphor. First, technique, because I want us by the end of these 2 hours to have some techniques, tactics. How can we write what's tough, genuinely? We can do it obliquely. Emily Dickinson said, we can tell the truth, but we can tell it slant. What does she mean by that? What does anyone mean by that? You don't have to expose everything. You don't have to be literal. You can indeed be very lyrical. You don't have to have you as the protagonist in anything that you're writing about. And metaphor is an incredible way of being able to approach something that's very tough indeed, potentially very tough, in a way that doesn't expose ourselves to something that's very raw and difficult. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to think about something that is potentially tough for you to write about. Maybe you have tried to write about it in the past, but it's still causing you some discomfort, or you're querying whether to write about this thing more in the future. I want you to think about this, and maybe the thing that you wrote down earlier on in the hour. I want you, for yourself, on your notepads or on your device, to write down, and I'll give an example from my own experience. If this were a home, what would this thing look like and feel like? So this difficult thing that we may be avoiding, that we might wish to self-censor, this difficult, tough thing that we might not want to write about for whatever reason, If this were a home, to repeat the question, what might it look like and feel like to enter into that space? Let me give an example from my own experience. I intend possibly one day to publish a piece about my own relationship with my father and the lineage in his ancestry where mental health conditions seem to have been inherited or at least transcended, and trauma has transcended from one generation to the next. But it's a difficult thing to write about. There are ethical complications in doing so. If I think about it as a home, that seemingly impossible thing to write about, my family's mental health history, I see it as a home at the end of a very long path in a forest. It's got one light on. It's calling me to approach. There's something that's calling me, that's intriguing me. But all the other rooms in that cottage are dark. From the end of the path, I can't see what's in them. There's something enticing and intriguing about that home. I want to follow the path to find that home. But there's also something forbidding. I'm not quite sure I want to enter. So that's my metaphor. So my question to you is, and I want you to spend 5 minutes, and then we'll go into break, actually. And we'll give you all a comfort break. I want you to just draw anything that comes down to you. Don't worry what comes to you. Just write it down. What home comes to mind? What does it look like? What would it feel like to be in that home when you think about this thing that's tough to write about? Does that make sense? Any questions? Okay, well, we'll set the clock for 5 minutes. You can continue in your break if you wish to, but please do take your comfort break. And what we'll do is just check in with Gidra and Vanessa. How long a break is good for everybody to have?
I think we could do another 5 to 7 minutes or something like that.
Perfect. So here we go, 5 minutes just to reflect on what does this home look like? What does it feel like to you? This tough thing to write about. See you shortly. famous mute button there. Thank you. Thanks so much. We encourage you at this moment to take a comfort break. By all means, carry on writing if you're in the flow. And we'll come back in about 7 minutes. And we'll continue with some thoughts from other writers. And we'll continue with some exercises where we can continue to write about the tough stuff. See you shortly. Welcome back. Thank you. I hope you had a chance to have a drink, or if you were writing more, to feel that you could really get into the flow of that exercise. So before we move on to one more writing exercise, I just want to check in with everybody. Any questions at all? Any reflections on what you've just done as an exercise there? Particularly around, is this a way, drawing a metaphor, thinking of this tough topic as a home, is this a way of starting to explore the topic? What was coming up for you? Really keen to hear from you if you've got any immediate thoughts or reflections. You can chat away as ever in the chat box. I know one of you is typing already, I think. And as always, we'd love to hear from you on camera too. In the meantime, I'm going to share some quotes from some writers where they're going to be maybe familiar to you, some of them maybe less familiar, about their experience of writing. Some of these are covered in the handout, but let's repeat them. So we've already had one. My silence had not protected me. Your silence will not protect you, by Audre Lorde, The Cancer Journeys. Arthur W. Frank in The Wounded Storyteller asks a similar question. Who is preserving what silences? What do they imagine is being protected by silence? That's about writing about illness and the ethics of doing so. The Wounded Storyteller, hugely recommend it. Another quote now. One of my favorite writers, some of you may be really familiar with their work, Carmen Maria Machado, who wrote In the Dream House and Her Body in Other Parties. Their question, what gets left behind? In other words, when we don't write certain things, when we don't write about the tough stuff. Their question again, what gets left behind? Gaps where people never see themselves or find information about themselves. Holes that make it impossible to give oneself a context. And Saidiya Hartman, that first writer that I quoted right at the beginning of the workshop, author of Lose Your Mother. And what do stories afford anyway? A way of living in the world, in the aftermath of catastrophe and devastation? For whom? For us or for them? Thank you, Joe. Getting some responses through. I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but anyone else got anything that they would like to share? Joe's provided a metaphor here. I don't know if any of you wish to either share your metaphor. Yeah, Olivia, yeah, great.
Hi. Yes, thank you for that that prompt about the house, because it really sparks some inspiration for me. Because what I realized, well, the question that I had in my mind as I came to this workshop was, how do I sit down and write this story that I want to write? Like literally, like I know what I want to write. Like I know I just need to sit down and write it and make the time, but there was something missing. And when I started to think about the house, what I've realized is I need to give myself what I didn't have in the moment when I was experiencing this difficult thing that I want to write about. So because that's part of the healing story in the end. But I need to give it to myself now. So for me, I want plush, feminine colors on the walls. I want the feeling of women's company around me, like be it with books or images and things like this. It's basically the opposite of how I felt back then. Because if I'm going to go back to that time of my life where I experienced this thing, I don't want to go into it re-traumatizing myself with the lack of that thing that I felt that I was missing in that moment. Does that make sense?
Totally makes sense. Yeah.
So I want femininity, candles, female company, all present around me, and that's also the feeling that I want the end product to look like, to feel like as well for the reader, you know. So thank you so much for that. That's really given me a really great inspiration. It's unblocked something in me, so I'm going to be able to go on now with this and take some concrete steps towards it. So thank you.
That's really good to hear. I think this is the power of being able to write based on a prompt and not having any sort of prior knowledge whatsoever about where that will take us. And things can subconsciously emerge. And then that can be a route into the writing itself. And one of the things that I think really is common in coaching is asking people a counterfactual question. And I think one can ask a similar question in relation to what you've just been sharing, Olivia, which is, in this tough experience or tough event or tough life memory that we might be reflecting on, what is it that we didn't have? What, in hindsight, would we like to have occurred? What could have been an alternative experience? If this experience were to occur again, and some of us might say, God forbid, but if it were to occur again, what would we want instead to be in place in terms of support? These are all types of questions that come from a coaching kind of lens. There are counterfactual books. Robert Harris has written about what would happen if the Nazis did win the war and the US were allies of Hitler, you know, going all the way through to Hitler's birthday, well into the 1960s. I'm not talking about writing counter histories, but in your thinking around what's tough, one way of venturing into it is to say, I'm not going to write about exactly what was tough, the raw emotion, as Annie was referencing earlier. I want to write about what I would have liked to have happened instead, or the support that could have existed but didn't. It's a counterfactual. Okay, any final thoughts before we move on? Any kind of reflections on that exercise? Some of you have shared the metaphor, a house of horrors with clowns, wobbly floors, and people jumping out at me. Really speaking of something that doesn't feel part of the day-to-day norm. Tony, yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. It's a very interesting point, finding a metaphor. You know, it's something I'd never thought about. And in fact, I've been spending this past 15 minutes trying to think of a different metaphor, because what happened, you know, what was tough for me, what was in fact embodied in a home, you know, many years ago. And so to use a home as a metaphor really was kind of even frightening for me. So, you know, I've been trying to find a metaphor, you know, something else. But I mean, it is a very interesting thing to think about.
And this question of re-traumatizing is talked about a lot in work on writing tough stuff. So Roxane Gay, who some of you might be familiar with, who's written Bad Feminist and also Hunger, has experienced and talks about in her writing something very traumatic indeed, sexual violence. And it has informed a lot of their writing since. But she says in a lot of her work, she's a lecturer on memoir and nonfiction, that particularly women, actually, she's focused particularly on women writers. She feels there's a gendered element here, but for any writer too, how do we avoid cannibalizing ourselves is the phrase, the question she poses. What she means by that is, how do we avoid going to the place that publishers or editors or our readers might wish us to venture to, but which almost feels like we're sort of consuming ourselves with being in the service of others' expectations of our writing, we're being self-destructive. How can we avoid cannibalizing ourselves? That's the question Roxane Gay poses, to avoid re-traumatizing ourselves. How can we approach something sideways, obliquely, again, lyrically? How can, if we wish to, avoid writing something literally? Just again, worth thinking about. I wanted to get a bit of a discussion going about two extracts I've got, which seem almost somewhat in opposition to one another. And I'd love to get your reflections in group, in plenary here. I'm just going to read them. They're about, can we write from a place of quote unquote chaos? Okay, so let me just read them out to you and see what you think. Okay, so this first extract is from The Wounded Storyteller by Arthur Frank, who says at one point, "Those in chaos are least able to tell a story because they lack any sense of a viable future. Life is reduced to a series of present-day assaults. If a narrative involves temporal progression, chaos is anti-narrative." Totally different word now, different quote. Jen Ashworth, Notes Made While Falling, who says, "I was really aware of the type of stories that people who have been sick are supposed to write. The recovery memoirs, the good news stories, the look at the mess in the rearview mirror type tale. I didn't have that type of story available to me. I was writing from inside the experience. And I started to wonder if the idea of recovery memoir was actually a way of making sure that the still sick person didn't speak." Immediate thoughts. You don't need to be an academic. We're not looking for literary criticism here. Any immediate thoughts around, can one write about something that's tough whilst you're still experiencing that thing that's tough? Let's pose the question that way. Can you write? Can anyone write? Can one write well, might be another way of framing the question, when we're going through the thing that's seemingly chaotic and tough? What does that involve? What does it require of us? What does it look like to others to be sharing that work? Thoughts about those extracts and that topic. Can we write when things actually are tough for us? Love to hear your views, your experiences of this for yourself. Is Arthur Frank right, in your opinion, to say those in chaos are least able to tell a story? Got some views coming in now. Yeah. Okay, Marta.
Yeah, I'm sorry that it's so dark here. It's just that I can't, it's so hot that I can't really turn any more lights on. I'm sorry. I don't have a lot to say about the chaos, except my reaction to the quote was very strong. I hated it. I guess it's because I'm in the middle of a lot of chaos and I want to try to find answers by writing about it. So my reaction was really, really visceral. I was thinking, how can it not? Of course it can be done. I find it a bit, maybe it goes along the lines of, I think that when we have a clear message of something we want to say before we start writing, it's dangerous. Having that, pre-packaged sort of message that we want to carry through what we write. And maybe a way out of chaos through writing is about finding exactly what we want to say. So I don't know, but it was funny, my reaction to it. But those are two of my favorite quotes from what you sent us. And I find them both very, very powerful. The second one was about, let me just go back, sorry. About being ill, which is very appropriate to me. And I found it really interesting as well, that it's along the same lines, of not knowing. It's possibly a bit detrimental to the writing if you already know that you want this positive message of a good recovery when you're talking about illness, that rearview mirror of and everything was fine. So I think writing from the chaos can help get out of the chaos, I'm hoping.
Yeah.
That's all I have to say.
One thing Marta said just springs to mind. Sorry.
Yeah. If you've got an immediate reflection on what you've just heard, Gabriel, do come in.
I just want to say, Marta, I think we're all in chaos. I think everyone's life it's a subjective chaos, but chaos is where we all come from, I think, because we're so many different things in one day. So I don't really understand that this person seems to assume that their life is not chaos, is a very subjective feeling. So I think we're always going through it. And I think if you're ever waiting for a point to start writing when you're not going through it, then you're never going to really start writing.
Yeah.
So, you know, just I hear you, girl. Chaos.
But it's a really interesting quote, I think.
Yeah.
And we've got 2 other comments. I'm going to go to Annie, if you are there. Yeah.
I hear you guys. Chaos is sort of the is a beautiful trigger, and it brings out the emotion, right? But sometimes I question if what I'm writing when I'm in the middle of all of it, if it's journaling versus writing, or is there even a difference? Is it, you know, just what's happening on my day, and then there's a end question mark, and then what? Or I don't know, does it have to lead to something? Should there be a bigger message? I don't know. So it's just journaling through the chaos to process it, or something that that is publishable.
Yeah, Leslie Jameson, who wrote the Empathy Exam, says that what really engages her with any writing that's tough is where someone does indeed look at their life, maybe autobiographically, but their life experiences aren't there as for the reader to observe or absorb as if they're a psychotherapist in the room with them, or as if they're a priest in confession, but they're there in the service of constructing an argument. In other words, life events are there in service of creating a piece of art, as opposed to just exposing and divulging what someone is going through at a particular moment in time. I'm not offering any moral judgment one way or another on any of these writers and their opinions. I'm just sharing this to aid our discussion. So one view there, in response to what you've just said, Annie, Leslie Jameson, a writer who's done a great talk, you can find it on YouTube, on the possibilities of the personal. She's also written an article on this in The Atlantic, is how do we intellectually construct an argument about what we've gone through that might hope to connect with and resonate with the reader? How do we create room for the reader to draw out some meaning for themselves from what we're sharing with them, as opposed to just making it entirely our experience? Does that connect in any way? I'm hoping that does feel relevant, Annie, in terms of what you've just shared.
Absolutely. I'm gonna have to Google her.
Yeah, the possibilities of the personal.
Okay. Thank you.
And Olivia, we had you also, yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. I was just reflecting that I think yes, you can write from the chaos. I've done it a little bit, nothing too dramatic, I must say, nothing too terrible or painful, but in doing so, it did help me find a way through it and creating art out of it, like as you said. And I felt like it was one of the most powerful pieces that I'd written, and readers, like I had people share it on Facebook, saying this is how I'm feeling, you know, and sharing it with them, and then their mum and dad were commenting underneath, you know, stuff like that. So I think it can be done. I just wanted to share that.
I think the great thing about writing, and Julie Bolton, who is a lecturer on personal writing, says this, is there are no rules. The only rule is there are no rules. You know, like, who is there to tell you what to do when you've got your, by the way, this is the wrong book to pick up. This is my 6-month baby's nursery rhymes. So why that's available next to me as an example, that shouldn't be. But in terms of any book, any journal that you have available to you when you write, there are no rules. And you can make a promise to yourself, as indeed Melissa Phoebos makes to herself. She's been in a great talk, which I hugely recommend to you, with Birkbeck University of London, together with Julia Bell, a lecturer on non-fiction, and Lily Dunn, a memoirist. And what Melissa Phoebos, who's written Bodywork on the power of personal writing, has said is she makes a personal promise to herself at the beginning of anything that's tough that she's writing about. And my goodness, has she written about tough stuff? Codependency, her life experience in a job where she was actually doing some very difficult work. She says she makes that promise to herself that this never has to be shared until she's absolutely resolved that she doesn't have any remaining doubts or questions about what impact that would have on her life. So indeed, when you're going through chaos, if it does feel like chaos, there are no rules to what you do. But it's perfectly possible that you do make one rule. And this is what I want to come to next, which is that you may not write it at all. Which sounds counterintuitive in a workshop, which is about writing what's tough. But I think rule number one in any discussion about writing what's tough is actually having a think about where you want to head. You might start writing something, but you might then quite understandably want to stop writing that thing, park it, pause, say you want to return to it another day. Gilly Bolton and Celia Hunt both talk about how we need to create boundaries and containers. And this is crucial. How do we avoid overwhelming ourselves? What are the risks that we face when we write the tough stuff? And how can we mitigate those risks or minimize them? And when they talk about boundaries and containers, they talk about quite obvious things. How can we write in 15-minute chunks of time, which is indeed what we might do with the journal. Julia Cameron talks about morning pages. How can you write when you wake up immediately in a sort of dreamlike state, but where things feel almost sort of non-consequential? What you write has no consequence potentially. How can you write as if it were to an imagined friend? Earlier, we talked about your ideal reader. One constraint for us sometimes in why we don't write the tough stuff is we actually imagine not an ideal reader, but a non-ideal reader. Someone for whom this piece that we're writing feels very personal indeed. So one technique or tactic around keeping yourself safe, creating a boundary, is if you were to write a tool, who would you hope could read this? What do you like to think might be their motivations in reading you? How would you like to be received by that person? Can you write with that person in mind, almost like Jiminy Cricket on your shoulder? And in terms of containers and boundaries, how can you not in any way limit your voice in terms of your conviction or your authenticity or the passion around what you want to write, but how can you write in a way that feels manageable in terms of time and intensity? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to play a piece of music now, which I personally feel is very calming to me and is an anchor to me. It's a piece of classical music. And I introduce it deliberately because I feel that another thing that can help us write the tough stuff is thinking through resources, a talisman, an inspiration, thinking of a memory that's positive, that's an anchor. What I mean by that, the word anchor comes from the coaching world, something that roots you in what feels positive to you, something that's self-supporting. This piece of music is self-supporting. I listen to it when I write tough stuff because it keeps me feeling balanced. It keeps me feeling rooted. I'm going to play it. When I play it, what I would love you to do is spend 4 or 5 minutes identifying what could be your containers and your boundaries. How can you create these? What might they be in terms of writing the tough stuff, but managing and mitigating and minimizing the risks to yourself as you do so? What might be the resources available to you? That could be people or things. What are the things available to you within yourself? What are your own skills? What are your resources that allow you to write, but without experiencing overwhelm? Does that make sense as a task? Any questions? I'm going to try and play this without my headphones on, and you'll tell me if it's playing or not. Just one moment. There might be an advert which will be annoying. but I will go to it. You can start writing down already. Okay. So the piece of music is Aquarium by Camille Saint-Saëns. And so some of you said you could only hear it in waves, and it's breaking up. So by all means, you can put it on your own device. Aquarium by Camille, that's Camille. I'm going to put it in the chat box. Camille Saint-Saëns. And by all means, if you would love to play it for yourself, whilst you do this exercise, you can. Okay, so in another word, in another sort of way of describing it, I'm going to put it in the chat box. And what we're really getting at is how can you identify for yourself, and it has to work on your terms for you personally, 3 things. It could be a memory, a song, a particular image, a photograph you can have on your desk as you're writing, a talisman, a particular object that gives you strength. Anything at all. What I'd love you to do is now identify 3 images or resources or anything at all, techniques that could help you as you write tough or sensitive material. What might they be? What could you make more use of? I'll give my personal one. When I'm writing about the tough stuff about donating a kidney to my father, and what that meant in terms of the implications for my mental health. I remember a very particular moment where I made the decision to donate my kidney to him, where I was actually on New Year's Eve, and I was entering the Atlantic Ocean, and I was staring up at the sea and at the sun. And I always take myself back to that memory. It was a real moment of clarity for me. And I actually have a drawing that I did of it on my desk when I'm writing the tough stuff. What might be your personal images, resources? Have a think. Give you a few minutes for that. Okay. We're very happy to hear, actually, on this occasion, what those resources might be, if you're willing to share them. Anything at all. I shared one of mine. We'd love to hear, what are the resources available to you from within, from other people, that give you at least the ability to connect with something positive and that keeps you connected with what really you value. It keeps you connected to what keeps you calm. What might they be? Any thoughts? I'd love to hear from you. Does this even come to you sometimes with your writing, when you are writing about what's tough? Or to frame it another way, what techniques do you use? Do you have tactics for how you manage writing about the tough stuff? In terms of time, how you manage yourself and your emotions?
I could just give one thing on that just comes to mind immediately is I never stop to keep writing, I have to keep reading. So I go back a lot to my stalwarts, my favorite writers, the ones who inspired me to keep writing, and the ones who are, and I don't know if this is correct or not, who have written things in a not a similar vein, but yes, I would say that in a similar vein. You know, you mentioned Roxane Gay. She writes about body issues. Reading her work has actually really informed what I'm working on, which is self-acceptance of my own body, for example. So I find that is helpful.
Thanks, Gabriel. Yeah, reading for comfort, for solidarity, for inspiration, to find a mirror. And indeed, many people will read our work when we write about tough and sensitive material, very much in that same vein. Tony, yeah, please.
Yeah, no, when I write, I generally practice my guitar. In fact, very often I do both at the same time. That's it.
As a prompt for your writing, or will you actually go back and forth between your writing and your playing?
Yeah, I go back and forth. You know, I find if I think about it too much, you know, I can't get things like kind of out of my subconscious, I guess, and it just helps to. It's almost like muscle memory. You know, that's the way when you practice, it's muscle memory. You know, to learn something, and so you have ideas back there, but they're hard to bring them. It's hard to bring them out, and so when you're not trying so hard to bring them out, they appear.
Thank you, Tony. So I'm going to share something in the chat box, which hopefully might be a PDF you might be able to download. It's an image. This comes from neurology, neuroscience. It's very basic image, really. Our nervous system sees us reacting, all of us in a very primitive way, really. We've been conditioned over millennia to react in a particular way to our different mood states and to the energy that we're feeling. And some of those mood states will carry into our writing. So what is this image? If you download it or zoom into it, sometimes when we're feeling at our best, most connected to our thoughts, when we feel most embodied, we're actually really clear on what it is that we're feeling. We're often said to be in ventral. Don't worry about the terminology here. That's neither here nor there. It's the ideas that count here. You feel connected to yourself and to the greater world. And that's where some of our best work can be done. But here's my point. When you're at the other end of the continuum, which we often are, after all, we're human, when you're in a place where things do feel chaotic, you're either extremely hypervigilant, you feel in that sense of fight or flight, or you're even lower down on that ladder, and you're in a place where creativity, art feels like the last thing, the last resource available to you. We can always attune ourselves to work out, where am I really? And what can I bring into my writing? And none of these places are in any way an impossible place to start writing from. There's nothing impossible about any of them. The quality and tenor and tone and color of your writing might differ. Your voice, the quality of your narrative, perhaps may differ too. But we don't have to write, particularly indeed about the tough stuff, just from a place where we're feeling entirely calm and collected. In fact, as Gabriel was mentioning earlier, there may be many moments where we're feeling quite chaotic indeed. And that is quite okay too. I know my go-to place when I write is to be somewhat overexcited. I'm somewhat over-caffeinated. I often write almost as a reaction to criticism. If I experience something bad that day, whatever it is, I almost write as a sort of a kind of a reflex to say, well, F you, sorry, pardon my French. What is your go-to reflex? When do you write? What is your mood state? Any thoughts in the chat box? Is there a time of day? Is there a kind of a mood or an energy that you find is more conducive to your writing, particularly about the tough stuff, or not? I ask these questions because it's really important that we're really clear about what are the tools available to us, but also what are the triggers for our writing, but also what are the things that we might seek to avoid? Because actually we know if we go there in a particular mood or a particular energy, we're not going to write in the way that we wish to. Olivia, I need space, no distractions. Anyone else? Also on camera. Sobriety, yeah. Absolutely. No judgment with any of this. Please do feel free to share if you can, if it's comfortable to you. What kind of expectation do you hope to have at the end of your writing? In terms of like where you want your mood to be at the end of your writing? Is there a place or a destination in terms of your mood that you'd like to get to when you've finished writing? Clarity. A feeling of connection. Yeah, great. Deeper intimacy with self. Keep all of this in mind. Keep those images in mind, those resources available to you. This will all be available to you, or could be available to you on your path as you write the tough stuff. Where do you want to get to? And also being clear, on the contrary, what do you wish to avoid? Got more answers coming through. I want to be able to read what I've written again and enjoy it as an objective reader. Yes. Anyone want to expand on any of their answers here? We've only got about 9 minutes left, so keen to get any of you who want to expand on what you've shared with us on video.
I'll speak to one thing, and that's sobriety to a certain degree, because it is kind of a well known among my peers that it's a constant question in my head. You know, you have this romanticized version of downing a bottle of wine and then diving into your work because it liberates you of all inhibitions and lubricates that kind of, you know, writer's nature. But at the same time, I've noticed that when I've done that, and trust me, I've done it, is that the next morning I look back at the work and there's either a certain pretense I don't like or a voice that wasn't true to the situation, writing a memoir. And I've learned that for myself, I'm really trying to find that balance of a social, outgoing nature that does enjoy a drink. And I'm speaking specifically to those who are a little bit more hedonistic in the way they live their lives, and how to balance that with the craft of writing. And if it's all or nothing approach. And I've realized too that, I mean, obviously moderation is the key word, but for myself, I do need a certain level of complete, almost homeostasis in my body. I need an exercise body, a a body that's fed with nutritiously. Thank you. And the circumstances in my own kind of gut have to be correct. You know, writing from a dark place doesn't work anymore with the years.
And this can take a lot of self-work, and no one imagines that any of this is stuff we work out quickly. It can be life's work, and in fact, the writing can be about the difficulties we experience in writing. We can be very self-reflective and reflexive in that way. When academics talk about containers and boundaries, they're talking about this sometimes with people like Sylvia Plath in mind. I know that she gets quoted often as someone for whom there's a tension, because would you rob historically someone like Sylvia Plath of the many different emotions she was experiencing that was driving her writing? It's a rhetorical question. There's no right or wrong answer, I don't think, to this. But what some of these academics will cite with someone like Sylvia Plath, and they're not trying to make direct comparisons here, but is to cite that actually the very life force the very drive that makes our work intrinsically, idiosyncratically what it is, can also be the thing that tips us into a state of potential self-harm. And I don't make this point lightly. I think it's a really profound point on which to end, because I think the key that we wanted from this workshop, which is how can you take risks, but how can you do it in a way that feels comfortable enough, that doesn't ever take you into a zone that feels like a panic zone. We have a comfort zone, we have a stretch zone or a growth zone, and then we have a panic zone. Dare yourself, perhaps, if you wish to move into the stretch or growth zone with your writing. What calculated risks can you take? Where have you been self-censoring? What might you venture into saying that you haven't in the past? Be aware, though, with yourselves, what's the panic zone? Where is that place, and only you can decide this for yourself, that doesn't feel in the end at all comfortable? Tony, yeah, you have a question.
Yeah, because you're going panic zone. Why is panic zone the largest zone?
Why is
you're doing this like the panic zone is the largest zone. Do you mean to say it's the largest zone?
No, sorry, my gestures are not at all.
Oh, okay.
No, so it's the outermost limit of where you wish to go.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So, in the end, to conclude, and keen to get any final reflections or thoughts, what we hope to have got across today is a few things. That there is a history of any of us writing from a place where we can feel our voices aren't creditable and that people might not even want to hear us. That particularly can be true for people who are marginalized, who are writing about things where they can be gaslit or shamed or stigmatized for writing about the things they wish to write about. Melissa Phoebos says that she doesn't think it's coincidence that women in her workshops can be asked the question, why would you write another misery memoir? You know, and there's real connotations when people pose that kind of question. Oh, your story has been told 1,000,000 times. We don't want to hear that kind of story again. And what she says in her essay, The Heart Work, Navel Gazing is a Subversive Act. I really recommend you read it. It's a very manageable essay to read. She says, this isn't navel gazing, or if it is navel gazing, it's not narcissistic. What it would be narcissistic to do is to write about oneself as if we were only full of self-praise, glowing with self-praise about ourselves, without any sense of our flaws or our weaknesses or anything at all that feels contextual about our history. She says, no, personal writing is far from narcissistic. It's quite the opposite. It's not gauche to write about things that are personal or tough. It's subversive. It's radical. In a period where testimony is often political and necessary and powerful, we've had the Me Too moment, we've had the movement, we've had Black Lives Matters, where people's voices have been denied systemically, endemically, historically through institutions. What Melissa Phoebos says, and she's my go-to commentator on this, is your story matters. Whether someone reads it and loves it or doesn't, that's another question for another day. All of our stories.
We will send a follow-up with, I believe, some takeaways from Andrew and a link to the recording, as mentioned, that you can view for 2 weeks. We also want to say that we have several upcoming workshops, but the next one is on July 15 with Anna Poloni, and it will be about editing or self-editing, be your own best editor. And if you would like, if you're not yet following us, we have a Substack where you can sign up and you'll get updates on workshop masterclasses. And if you're in Madrid, also our in-person author talks. So thanks again for coming and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.